Hey there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation. My name is Luis Silva, and today we're looking at world history, the American Revolution, 1775, all the way to 1783. What will we learn today? Today we are going to identify the causes and result of the American Revolution, or the United States. Let's begin with the settlement of North America. During the Age of Exploration, Europeans began colonizing in North America. England granted joint stock charters to colonists who were searching for wealth or religious freedoms. From 1607 all the way to 1733, England established 13 colonies in America. The colonies were very different and also lacked unity. As you can see here from the image to your right, these are the American colonies. These were the colonies that rebelled against England and declared themselves independent from England. Now, economics and government in America. England used mercantilism to control colonial trade and increase their profits. Despite these trade restrictions, the colonists made money trading with England. England used a policy called salutary neglect, which allowed colonists freedom to make their own laws and taxes. And this is to the left, you see an image here of how the colonial government was structured. Way at the top of the colonial government, you had the British Crown. Underneath the British Crown, you had the royal governors, which were appointed by the Crown, oversaw colonial trade, had final approval on laws, and could also dismiss colonial assembly. Underneath the royal governor, you had consuls, which were appointed by the governor, advisory board to the governor, and acted as highest court in each colony. And then you also had colonial assembly, which were elected by eligible colonists, made laws, had also authority to tax, and paid the governor's salary. So this was the colonial government. Americans created their own colonial assemblies and also enjoyed self-government. Now, the French and Indian War, which went from 1754 all the way to 1763, brought changes to the relationship between England and the 13 colonies. For 150 years, colonists were happy with this relationship with England. But everything changed after the French and Indian War. In 1754, England and France went to war for 7 years over territory in America. In 1763, England won the war, and the Treaty of Paris gave England all French lands east of the Mississippi River. If you see at the map to the left, and this is North America in 1763, you see that the British control expanded further west, and you see also French areas that were controlled. You see the areas that were controlled by the Spanish, and also certain areas that were controlled by the Russians. But the French and Indian War left England with a massive debt, which they had to pay back. To pay off the war debts, Britain created a series of new taxes on the American colonists. The colonists were upset that Parliament in England would pass laws without the colonists' approval. And you see from the political cartoons how the colonists were reacted to the different ways that Great Britain was going about and collecting money from them in order to pay for the war. Now, the colonists were very angry, and one of their slogans became "No taxation without representation." This was very common among the 13 colonies, as they were, again, very angry, upset with the mother country, Great Britain, for taxing them. Now, colonists responded to new taxes with boycotts or refusing to buy British goods that were taxed. Boycotts were effective, but the king and parliament believed the Americans should obey British laws and took power away from the colonial assemblies. From 1763 all the way to 1776, tensions between English government and the American colonists increased. And we have some of the British actions right here. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed. And obviously, Britain was trying to collect money from the colonists by taxing them. Now, again, the colonists reacted by saying there should not be any taxes or no taxation without representation. And that this was something big within the American colonists. In 1770, the Boston Massacre took place, in which the British troops stationed in Boston are taunted by angry mob. The troops fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. Now, the colonists were not very happy about this. They were very angry. And colonial agitators labeled the conflict a massacre and published a dramatic engraving depicting the violence. As you can see from the bottom there, the engraving. In the year 1773, the Tea Act was passed. Britain gives the East India Company special concessions in the colonial tea business and shuts out colonial tea merchants. Now, the colonial reaction. Colonists in Boston rebelled against this, dumping 18,000 pounds of East India Company tea into the Boston harbor. In the year 1774, the Intolerable Acts were passed. This is what the British did. King George III tightens control over Massachusetts by closing Boston Harbor and quartering troops. Now, the colonial reaction. Colonial leaders from the First Continental Congress draw up a Declaration of Colonial Rights. In 1775, we get to Lexington and Concord. British action. General Gage orders troops to march to Concord, Massachusetts, and seize colonial weapons. Now, the colonial reaction. Minutemen intercept the British and engage in battle. First at Lexington and then at Concord. So the colonists were very angry and they were ready to fight Great Britain. Now, Americans were literate and read books about leading Enlightenment thinkers, especially John Locke, and used these ideas to justify their protest. Here we have basically how the Enlightenment played a significant role on American Declaration of Independence. Enlightenment writers challenged many ideas about government and society. Now, those ideas spread all over the place. Enlightenment ideas spread throughout Europe and also to colonial America. Ultimately, the Enlightenment ideas brought about the American Revolution. And these are some of the main concepts. People are born with natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Kings can be overthrown if they violate people's natural rights. And government power comes from the consent of the governed. These are Enlightenment ideas that impacted the way colonists saw the world and their own independence. British abuses and Enlightenment ideas inspire Americans to declare independence. Now, these are some of the changing ideas. Colonial attachment to Britain. The old idea said American colonists consider themselves to be subjects of the British king. The new idea said, after a long train of perceived abuses by the king, the colonists asserted the right to declare independence. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson served on the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. And these are the 3 American philosophies: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. And the main goal was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 4th, 1776, Americans sent King George III the Declaration of Independence. And now we have here the Declaration of Independence analysis. What did the Declaration of Independence say, and why was it such a revolutionary document? And here we have the Declaration of Independence and the influences from the Enlightenment. If you need to pause this video in order to read this Declaration of Independence, please do so. The Declaration of Independence used ideas from the Enlightenment, especially John Locke, to explain why Americans were declaring independence. Thomas Jefferson begins the Declaration by attempting to legally and philosophically justify the revolution that was already underway. Here Jefferson is saying that now that the colonists have begun to separate themselves from British rule, it is time to explain why the colonists have taken this course of action. Once again, you're more than welcome to pause this video so you can analyze the Declaration of Independence. Now, the American Revolution lasted from 1775 all the way to 1783. If you can see to the right, you see a timeline of how the events shaped from 1767 all the way to 1783. And you see also a map to the left of the presentation. You also see that the battles basically that took place from 1775 all the way to 1781. You see there British victories. You also see there Patriot victories, and you also see nuclear victories. And if you look right at the center, you see a breakdown of how colonists were divided during this conflict. About 40% of the colonists were neutral, about 20% were loyalists to, in this case, Great Britain, and about 40% were patriots. In other words, they were willing to give their life in order to gain independence. After 6 years of fighting, the Americans defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown. Now, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, granted the United States independence from Britain in all lands east of the Mississippi River. If you see to the left, you have North America in 1763. You see everything that is basically controlled by the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Russians. Now, if you look to the right, you see the map of 1783, and you see all the lands that were basically controlled by the United States as it gained independence. With independence, the United States needed a national government to unite the new nation. Now, let's look at the government structure in the 13 colonies. The Founding Fathers created a federal system that created a national government but allowed the 13 states to keep power and make their own laws. Many of the ideas of the Enlightenment serve as inspiration for the new national government of the United States. Now let's analyze the Constitution. How did the Enlightenment influence the structure and power of the national government under the U.S. Constitution? You have a whole bunch of Enlightenment thinkers underneath this question that really influence how the U.S. Constitution was drafted and finally ratified. For example, popular sovereignty. The framers of the Constitution created a democratic republic, a formal government where the people elect their leaders. The U.S. Constitution was inspired by John Locke's idea that the government power comes from the consent of the governed. The Constitution also used Rousseau's ideas of a direct democracy because Congress and the president are elected directly by the people, majority rule. Limited government. The Founding Fathers were afraid of giving the national government too much power, so they stated exactly which powers the government had, and all other powers were left to the states, governments, or to the people. Both Locke and Montesquieu share the ideas of limiting government power. Locke believed that a limited government was the only way to protect individual liberties. Separation of powers. The Constitution uses separation of powers to divide the powers among three branches. The legislative branch consists of a Congress that makes laws and taxes. The executive branch consists of the president, vice president, and bureaucracy that enforces laws passed by Congress. The judicial branch is the Supreme Court and other federal courts that interpret laws. settle disputes, and decide guilt. This idea was inspired by Montesquieu. Now, Constitution concept number 3. In here we have, obviously, again, the legislative, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, the executive, which is the president, the vice president, the cabinet, and the judicial, which is the Supreme Court and the other federal courts. Checks and balances. To keep one branch from seizing all power, the framers of the Constitution used a system of checks and balances. Each branch of government holds power over the other two branches as means to limit their power. This idea was inspired by Montesquieu. In the concept number 4, the Constitution. In this case, you see how everything basically works. You're more than welcome to pause this video in order to analyze this image that you have in front of you. And we have the functions of the legislature, the Congress, we have the functions of the court, we have the functions also of the United States President. Individual liberty. The Founding Fathers added a Bill of Rights to the Constitution in order to guarantee that the government could not violate liberty. Among these liberties are the freedoms of speech, the press, and religion. The framers of the Constitution were inspired by the ideas of Voltaire. Now, due process. The Bill of Rights includes a number of protections of the rights of accused people. The Bill of Rights guarantees Americans freedom from self-incrimination, right to speedy trial, and protection from cruel and unusual punishment. These protections of accused people were supported by Beccaria. The American Revolution was an important event in world history. It was the first time a colony overthrew its mother country, in this case Great Britain. It was the first time a government was created using Enlightenment ideas of limited government and individual liberty. The success in America inspired revolutions in Europe and also Latin America. Now we have come to the end of this presentation. Please do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next presentation.